Thank you, Elena, for your provocative presentation. I would like to raise a few general points and a few specific questions that I have. I seem to have a problem maybe with your definition of corruption, which to me seems to connect too many different types of illegitimate behavior, if you want, right? So your argument is basically, from what I understood in the paper, is that economic corruption has a function, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be useful in some ways, right? So you're saying it's ambivalent, it has good and bad sides, right? But can we usefully differentiate between political and economic corruption? Because it seems to me that when we talk about economic corruption, right, when we talk about business corruption, a lot of the problems that we have in Ukraine, they arise from the fact that economy is overregulated, right, and there are no economic reforms. So this, economic corruption could be efficiently dealt with by economic reforms and easing regulation, right? Whereas we also have a different type of corruption that is now more of the interest to Ukrainian society, and that's the question of political corruption. And you referred to it in your presentation by talking about political leaders, right? And the question here is that for Ukrainians now, the question of this fight in the political corruption is a question of social justice, right? So from the second Maidan, it started, one of the slogans was "Hedge cortege," right? Down with the motorcades, and people were protesting against, all the leader Azarov and Litvin going on the streets and blocking the traffic and overusing their position, right? Because they could use these resources. And Yatsenyuk, when he became a prime minister, he knew better that in order to show off, he had to take an economy class flight rather than, use cortege, right? Mm-hmm. So the question became a question of came to the forefront of political life in the last year in Ukraine. And there were a lot of developments, as you all know. We created this anti-corruption bureau, right?
Natalka, maybe let's... let Elena...
So let me just wrap up the first question then, okay? So the question basically is not your definition of corruption too broad?
As I mentioned, corruption is usually defined as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. In our research, we focus only at corruption at the firm level, not in general corruption, as I mentioned, not on big businesses, not on political corruption, only at the firm level. And one example, probably another example, what does corruption mean at the firm level? For example, if manager goes on business trip and makes some manipulation with travel expenses, he abuses or she abuses the entrusted power for private gain. It might be called irregulation, it might be called informal practice, it might be called theft, it might be called fraud, but it's also one of the form of corruption. Corruption is probably not the best term, it's an umbrella term for many, many activities, and especially difficulties with these non-monetary activities. Yeah.
Because some of these informal practices could be pretty legitimate, right, in a normal business environment. And specifically, if you talk about maybe smaller companies and companies that are private, people always resort to things being done in an informal way, right? We have institutional economics that tells us that informal practices, informal rules are, a norm of economic behavior. So aren't we throwing here the baby with the water, right? When we talk about this in a kind of, when we don't differentiate, for example, between this type of the companies and the type of activities that they are engaged with. And do you have any, in your sample, do you have, for example, any business leaders that could be also connected to the political, corruption, right? Because to me, it seems like it's a much broader or much stronger term that is now, given social attention.
In our sample, we have large enterprises, but we don't have big businesses. Large enterprises with amount of people of about 1,000 or a little bit more than 1,000 people, but not really big businesses. We made this research in 2013, and we include all regions. We included all regions, and for us, it was very important to compare all of these regions. And big businesses are located in the eastern part of Ukraine. No, I cannot give any concrete examples or any concrete ties with the politics. Yeah.
Am I allowed one more question? Of course. Yes. And your other point in the paper, which seemed to be very well demonstrated, right? You're talking about how all the actors are used to this corruption, right? So you give an example of this business leaders, but you also talk about general population who say that, you know, all corruption is just part of our tradition. We should just deal with it, right? And then you give this example of young people, you know, cheating at the exams in the end of your paper. And the question is, could anything be done to basically change this culture, and how do we approach this? Or you don't have a suggestion for that?
Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question. Business corruption is not a sole corruption in Ukraine. It's entirely embedded in different types of corruption, in academia, in politics, in everyday life, in medicine. Yeah, it's difficult to fight against corruption. I think it's very important, especially in endemic corrupt environments, to understand, to acknowledge this problem and start to work on this in order to mitigate, to reduce a little bit corruption. But I think it's very difficult to fight against corruption in endemically environment. Yeah.
I'll ask you also a question while all the others think about and trying to find questions. I had a sense of kind of hesitation in your paper, and my question would be about your perspective. Because you have this policy perspective, I think, and in the conclusions, you were really in this perspective, how to combat corruption, actually fight corruption. And you have references to Transparency International, which is also kind of policy normative point of view on corruption. And on the other hand, you are very, the work you're doing, it's a very sociological work of with a non-normative view on corruption and trying to understand and grasp the sense, actually, what corruption means for your entrepreneurs and corruption as a way of redistributing within the family, for example, helping family friends, and etc., dealing with different administrative problems, and etc., etc. So my question, what is the perspective actually of your research? Is it to help to fight corruption, or is it just to provide senses? What are the ordinary senses on corruption? Maybe the second question, how do you define informal? What is informal practice? And actually the both are related, yeah, I think.
What is the practices?
Informal. What is an informal practice? How do you define it?
One of the main goals of our research is to try to understand why general manager uses practices and how do they justify, and probably help them to fight against or reduce corruption within their companies if they want to do it. It's one of our goals. And our definition of informal practices came from my first research conducted together with Denisova-Schmidt in Seattle and Elena Schmidt, UCL. We developed this research tool using Russian business environment. And we coded the negatively connotated word corruption into informal practices. Practices the ways of get things done. That's our definition of informal.
Informality has also formal. Formal means rules or something. So I don't see the reference point in your definition of informal practice.
Yeah.
Do you see my point?
No.
It's not just get things done, but get things done by maybe by passing rules, or what informal? It's in relation to something. You have a reference point, and I don't see the reference point for your practices, the practices you described. That's why my question about informality. informality, the opposite is formality. What is the opposite of informal practice?
Yeah, I believe in our research, informal practices, informality just substitute formal institutions that are really very weak and do not function. And this is our goal, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, thank you. Go ahead, Victoria.
Oh yes, no. My question would be, if we are asking about solutions, did you had a chance to look at new institutions? Because you might have old institutions which were embedded in corruption and they are continuing to do this, and new businesses and new firms. Are there different levels of corruption between old and new, or it's the same?
Yeah, we have some little indicators, but some little indicators we have probably to do more research on it. For example, some new areas like IT business. It's a new one without any Soviet experience. It's probably a little bit less corrupt, than other institutions. And we also have some indicators that some entrepreneurs, some general managers told to us that nowadays it's possible to do business without to corrupt any officials, just to try to do it. And especially it does work, at least in Lviv, in the western part of Ukraine.
Ina?
In your results, you tell us or show us that business uses corruption practices to speed up some procedures, so there is a positive connotation in it. But if we look at the results of surveys made by World Bank, enterprise surveys, or recent survey 2016 from Transparency International and Reagan Capital in Ukraine, corruption is almost the first obstacle to doing business for Ukrainian enterprises, especially middle and small. So how would you explain this contradiction in looking at corruption as a threat and obstacle to the business, and then, according to your results, something positive to get things done? And another issue which I'm just interested in, you are not presented it today, but did you check also whether there is any kind of enterprise activity to fight corruption, to say, for example, via business association, because especially small and middle-sized business in Ukraine is continuously and increasingly organized into business association. What is the role of this business association in these corruption networks? Thanks.
I think corruption might be bad, and as an obstacle. Corruption might be good to get things done, and corruption might be really very helpful, especially in countries with very weak institutions. And I believe that as Yuri refers to these international reports made by World Bank and by other institutions, they are made by Western researchers with their Western approach, that corruption is an obstacle. It might be defined and it might be reduced. But I look, and my colleagues will look at this problem from the Eastern European perspective, from the Ukrainian perspective, that corruption might be also good, and corruption might be help to do things done. And there are two different perspectives. And according to business association, I found that they're really very helpful and they're very useful, especially in Ukraine.
We have. Go ahead, please.
As I said yesterday, I'm a retired public servant, so just in response to the moderator saying, what's an informal practice basically in government is lack of documented policy and procedure. So it's people doing things maybe long established, but it's not documented, it's not formal. So maybe that's what you might mean by informal practice, I'm sure, in your sense. The question I have for you is, I was curious about the comment that the discussant said about and you didn't really answer it, I don't think, unless I missed it, the lack of the lack of administrative reform, and which is a Soviet legacy. This is something probably driving corruption because it gets in the way. And as a former bureaucrat, I know that I get in the way of people's things to do. So if you could answer that a bit more in terms of the extent of reforms and how that could actually ease the corruption issue. The third point I'd ask is if you could just expand a bit more on the bullet on anti-corruption campaigns being counterproductive. I mean, normally what happens, especially in non-democratic countries, when you have anti-corruption campaigns, they take the form of basically show trial type events where you trot out some big wigs, sack them, public outrage is satisfied, and then the problem doesn't go away. So if you could expand a bit more on actual attempts in Ukraine or in Russia that have backfired and why.
Starting with your second question, anti-corruption campaigns, I refer here in my paper on 2 experiments. One was conducted in Costa Rica, a very corrupt country, and the second experiment was conducted in Ukraine among Ukrainian students. This experiment, the second experiment, it also was my work together with my colleagues. This experiment, we tested the effects of anti-corruption information campaign among students. And we have several results. And one of these results was shown that young people without corrupt experience in academia learn about new corrupt techniques from our information campaigns. And that's why, it might be counterproductive. It might have opposite effect. And they also learn that if everyone around them are corrupt, they are also might be corrupt. It's allowed to them to be corrupt. If there are also different experiments showing that if people believe that everyone corrupt, it can be justified their one corrupt behavior. And about regulation, yes, as I mentioned, especially about small businesses and medium-sized companies, I believe the new regulation should give them more incentives not to hide their taxes, and that's hence they will employ their people not off the books. They will employ them legally, and in a long-term perspective, it will be much more better for their employees to be employed in a legal way.
We have a question, same row, but on the other side.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your very academic summary of the issue. But I'm reminded of the old expression which came to me from an elderly lady that I met who worked basically in the warehouse of a factory that made vodka in Chernihiv Oblast. And she said, "Ne kradeš, ne proživeš." If you don't steal, you won't survive. So my question is, how does the situation now compare to the experience of Soviet times? Because I lived and worked in both environments, in Moscow and then later in Kiev after independence. And this ties a bit with what my friend asked with the Soviet legacy, although I suppose it's a Tsarist legacy as well. But how does what is happening now compare in scale and content to what had been in the past? So I'd appreciate some comments on that.
I believe there are some new things and there are some similarities, especially referring to informal agreements, informal connections that has Soviet legacy, what we called in Soviet Union blood, to have very good connections to get things done. And it's still in existence, these informal practices, informal connections, there are still a very impressive tool to get things done, to do the business. They are still in existence. For example, in our first data set, we compared different regions, and in these different regions, we found that there are differences in terms of corruption comparing to regions. We found that, for example, the western part of Ukraine and the south part of Ukraine is less corrupt than the eastern part of Ukraine. Yeah, it's what one of the findings. And the second finding was that one of the frequent anti-corruption strategy used in the western part of Ukraine is to work with third parties on difficult issues. It means that corruption in the West might be outsourced. Yeah, it's one of the.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I have one quick question and then one more substantive question. The first is about your methodology, and if you could just clarify, was this through survey or through interviews? The second question, which probably depends slightly on the first, you mentioned that part of the goal of the research was to understand whether some of these actors wanted to combat corruption in their particular firms, and if so, to kind of help them, set them up to do that and provide them with a little bit more of a baseline of information to do so. So my question is, to what extent did you see that desire? And if you did see the desire to eliminate corruption in individual firms, did you see any distinctions between the reasons? Did you see regional differences? And how can that possibly be the case if the whole system is sort of against those individuals that might want to combat it just in that one specific context?
Yeah,
Thank
to
you.
the methodology, it was face-to-face interview in both cases. It was very important for us also to have some comments from the field, Yeah. As for the wish of companies to combat corruption, they think about it, but probably not in a short-term perspective. Probably in the middle-term perspective. In the short-term perspective, they need to survive. Yeah, it's probably one of the findings that we see. Yeah.
Yes, I'm the retired farmer, but I also worked in the Department of Agriculture, and I'd like to address to you and suggest to you, what do you think of this practical thing that we used to have in Canada? And I'm pretty sure Dominique remembers this well. We had a satire publication called Frank, excuse me, that used to expose corruption over there. But also, the example I'd like to cite to you, it was when we got what I'd say is a corrupt deputy minister into our department who knew nothing about agriculture. We called him the second coming of Stalin because he ruined our department. But anyways, we had this, before he came to our department, our department was never in this publication. When he came into our department, we had an article in this almost every publication which came out twice a month. So I was just wondering, have you ever thought about in places using a campaign such as that of a satirical publication? It was very interesting to read. At least over at the Department of Agriculture, we knew that we were not taken for fools by this corrupt deputy minister, and who brought in all his friends. And you said that nepotism is corruption, and he brought in so many people that knew nothing about agriculture, and that was what the bad thing was about our department, because we used to have a very good department. We had a minister of agriculture who put agriculture and our department on a very high world scale. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your recommendation. We will think about it. Yeah.
Hi, Elena. Thank you very much. It's a very, very timely topic. Finally, we have something really timely to think about. Did you cover anti-money laundering efforts? Do you see it as a part of corruption? Because this is a big, big issue currently discussed, for instance, in Canada, when there is a discussion about making the beneficial ownership, public. The list of all of those people who try to actually be anonymous, to make this information public. This is a big thing. And also, do you follow the U.S. efforts trying to actually eradicate corruption? They're a big act on this issue, so just wondering about you.
Thank you. Yeah. Just can you, the mic here, it says draw.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Anton Desglasny. My question is, did your research show in any maybe quantitative way the impact of corruption in Ukraine? For example, your research is at the firm level, so can we conclude that, you know, firm performance is reduced as a result of these informal practices, or can we conclude more the opposite, that actually firms are enabled, you know, they're more competitive as a result, and firms that don't engage in these, you know, irregular practices maybe can't survive? Anything you can shed light on? Just, I go back to the research from, you know, the World Bank and you know, even the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs, when they talk about trying to do business in Ukraine, right? That corruption is the #1 obstacle, but maybe from your perspective, you can tell us otherwise, that it's actually a major enabler for doing business in Ukraine. Thank you.
And the last question.
Okay. Maxime Saint-Arnaud, Université Montréal. I would like to know if, well, if you could inform us on the morphing, maybe, of the corruption with the new requirements of the European Union, United States. One of the goals of your work was to define what we were talking about in Ukraine. Would you say that it makes things more difficult now because it's morphing into something, maybe like contorting, well, skipping some kind of traditional corruption out there, and it becomes something else? So I would like to know about it.
Thank you.
Laundering money, yeah, certainly also.
I think it doesn't work.
Yeah, laundering money is certainly a type of corruption. But in our business research, we focus only at the firm level, only at the company level. We were not interested in this particular type of corruption. And I would like to add that this corruption at the firm level is under-researched, not only in Ukraine, but also in Western Europe and the United States. And one of my explanations why it's under-researched, I believe there are a lot of gray areas for businesses. If it will be very good researched, it means that CEOs and general managers, they have to differentiate very good between black and white, between good and bad, and it's really very difficult in some businesses and in some countries. About corruption, yes, we have some statistical data showing the function of corruption. One of these results is that corruption is not an obstacle for these companies, but we're talking, in our first data sample, we have domestic companies and foreign companies. And corruption certainly would be a problem with foreign companies working in Ukraine. And we believe that it's not a problem for Ukrainian companies, domestic companies, because they grew up in this system. They know how to deal with this system. This is a part of their system. It's not an obstacle for them. Yeah. And about general corruption, we now do a lot of research, not only on business corruption, but also on corruption in general public, everyday corruption, and also a lot of research on corruption in higher education. And the results are really very dramatic. Yeah, corruption in higher education, it's not only bribes to get a good mark or preferential treatment. There are also a lot of cheating, a lot of plagiarism, and yeah, it's really a big problem. But I believe young Ukrainian people do this corruption at university not because they're bad or university is bad. I believe the main problem, the systematical problem, the problem of the system, especially, for example, in higher education, the problem is massification of higher education. For example, in Ukraine, about 80% of young people, 80% of young people go to university and finish the university on time. It's a huge amount. For example, comparing to Switzerland, we have about only 30% of young people go to university. Yeah, we can discuss about it. Ukrainian people might be more brilliant than Swiss students or much more better, but I believe that not all 80% are able to study on such a high level, but they need a diploma to go and to live and have great professional future. And for many of them, to cheat, plagiarism, and to bribe, it's one of the ways to get things done. I believe this is a huge problem, yeah.
Let's thank you, Elena.